Hello, I'm Bob the Booker, and welcome back to my channel. As you will know from the title of this video, I have now finished the Booker 2021 Longlist, which feels like it took both a very long time and also happened very quickly, because I think I was sort of lucky enough to have basically read about 3.5 of them before the Longlist came out, and then in the last couple of weeks I had some time off and kind of blazed my way through the other ones. So I've now finished them all, and of the 13 books, I mean, it's so interesting to me. I really enjoyed this long list. I feel with a list of 13 books, you're obviously always going to find ones that you really enjoy and others that you do not. But overall, I think actually it's really interesting, because when this long list was first announced, I know that others, myself included, looked at the list and kind of sort of thought, okay, some big books missing off this list that we were expecting. So books like Detransition Baby, The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., books like Luster by Raven Leilani, Open Water by Caleb Adzumi Nelson. So many books that earlier this year I kind of thought may have a decent shot, or kind of would be kind of interesting contenders, or at least were books that people had really been speaking about. And it seems really strange to me still in some ways that those books aren't part of this sort of party as I'm reading these 13. But in many ways I'm also glad that this has really forced me to read books that I don't think I would necessarily have come across otherwise. And some of these have now become some of my firm favourites in this list. So I really want to talk about this in a kind of a couple of stages. So firstly, a quick review of the long list as it stands, and then from there my own personal predictions and desires for the shortlist of 6, which will be announced shortly. And then from there as well, what I think might actually be on the shortlist, because those are often different things, as I found from not only last year, but also just generally the Booker Prize and any prize really, and me trying to make any kind of predictions where I'm almost always entirely wrong. So with that said, let's go into the long list itself. So, the long list itself, as I mentioned earlier, it was one that was sort of, I say controversial, I mean that's maybe a very dramatic term for what it was, but it you know, it raised some eyebrows because some big name books that people were expecting just weren't there, and also there were books that made it onto the list that people hadn't heard of. For example, An Island by Karen Jennings, which at the time of the long list announcement had 10 reviews on Goodreads, and was, you know, from a small press, which meant it was difficult for people to track it down. We also had a few kind of confused sort of looks about some of the other ones, you know, that some books on there were not the ones that people would have expected. So for example, The Sweetness of Water, a lot of people had discussed it and thought actually A Sweetness of Water probably won't make it, but The Prophets will. And, you know, both books have somewhat similar plots, not plots, they're kind of set in sort of similar ideas around gay male relationships in sort of during particularly sort of Civil War kind of era in US history. And so for some people, the fact that these two books had sort of seemed to cover sort of somewhat similar ground, even though they do it very differently, was sort of one of those things where they thought, well, you know, it's going to be The Prophets instead of The Sweetness of Water, and then lo and behold, it's The Sweetness of Water. So I think there were kind of quite a few surprises for some people anyway, some books in there that people hadn't necessarily thought would be there as well, but it's the long list we have, and so it's then really interesting to go and check them out. And again, many of these books are ones that I probably would never have heard of, never mind had the chance to check out. So I'm really glad and really grateful for that. And I think that is something that is really great about prizes, even if they're books that you didn't get on with, even if they're not the books you would have chosen. I think there is something really valuable in kind of seeing what, in this point, you know, for the Booker Prize is a group of 5 people sitting down, having a conversation and choosing their favourite books from about 160 that were submitted, so over about 6 months, right? So I think it's really important to kind of note that this is this is, you know, not the be-all and end-all. This is a group of 5 people making their decision on their favourite books from that list. And so as a result, there are bound to be differences. You know, there's no real objective measure by which you can say a book is good or not, because obviously it can be so subjective in that sense. But let's get on with the long list itself and my thoughts. So I, as I sort of mentioned, was really pleasantly surprised by a good number of books on this long list. And ultimately my kind of dream shortlist is about 8 books. So that's good, because that means, you know, sometimes I've sort of looked at some long lists and thought, yeah, I'd be sort of scraping the barrel to find 3 that I was passionate enough to root about to have as the top 6 from this. But here, about 8, I think. But I want to sort of go through the ones that were, for me, were standouts, and then from there I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the shortlist itself. So this things that people have pointed out quite a lot about this long list is really about kind of some of these key themes, and accidentally every year there are kind of overarching themes to shortlists and long lists of books, and that's probably quite natural, right, in the sense that if you are somebody who's really passionate about a couple of things, there may be sort of elements of books that speak to you slightly more than they might other people, just because of that personal experience. So I know that I'm always really drawn to books about families. I'm especially drawn to tight family dramas that focus on sort of specific things. I really like books that are rooted in a sense of place, and you know, I also really like books often around nature and the environment and things like that, and with a bit of queer sprinkled into it, essentially. And it's interesting that people have pointed out that this long list has quite a lot around faith. So one book, Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Shiguro, is a book that focuses a lot on this idea of faith and how an artificial friend, sort of an artificial intelligence, sort of robot creation thing, can have faith. There is also the faith in, for example, The Promise by Damon Galgut, the idea of faith in sort of a future ideal, like a sort of national ideal. We also have the faith of The Overstory by Richard Powers, where we also get this idea of faith in something else, the idea of bringing people back potentially, or kind of connecting with people after they've left the earth. Francis Bufford's Light Perpetual is really rooted in this idea of faith as well, around sort of various people sort of really believing in things, and this idea of souls kind of featuring quite prominently in the book as well. So sort of that seems quite interesting, and particularly as, you know, an archbishop is on the panel of judges in Rowan Williams, and I think that's kind of interesting as well, that, you know, is how much of that was sort of driven by him, or was it also that, you know, there were other people in the room, or there must have been, otherwise his books wouldn't have been suggested. Other people must have liked his books enough, the books he liked as well, for them to get onto the long list, but perhaps his presence there, and perhaps the presence of somebody else, instigated more of a discussion on faith than maybe would have happened if he hadn't been in the room. So it's always really interesting to see how the makeup of the judges can really affect that. Another theme that people have really brought up is around parenthood, and particularly sort of a really close bond between one parent and one child. So again, when we look at kind of various stories that are on this, Clara and the Sun is really focused on a mother and her daughter, and particularly her trying to make the best life possible happen for her. In A Passage North, we get a lot about family sort of being important and the reason to kind of go and travel, but also ultimately that it's not, that your own sort of personal journey has to be a big part of that as well. Again, in Richard Powers' Bewilderment, we get a strong sense of the importance as well of family, and kind of going alone against the world almost, in sort of, in this case, in a sort of single parent family. And so I think it comes up in really interesting ways across these books, and it's just so interesting to me to see how it gets sort of manifested. And with that in mind, I have narrowed it down to kind of I'll talk about the 8 books I really love and then try and cull 1 or 2 of them to get down to the 6. We shall see. But here is my shortlist. So I should say at the beginning of this is my dream shortlist, not necessarily a prediction. I will make a slight prediction as well. So there are 2 books on this shortlist, on my sort of fantasy dream shortlist thing, that I think, if they're not there, I will be incredibly surprised and quite upset. So the first is Kill Surprise, The Promise by Damon Galgut. I did a video talking about this with Sean at the Book Maniac, and as you may be able to tell from our conversation about it, we loved it. I think this is such a stunning book. It really cleverly investigates whiteness and racism from within a white family in South Africa. It really unpicks what it means to be part of a nation, what it means to have promises, and also what it means to have privilege and pass that privilege on, or to hold it back. And in the meantime as well, we get this really tense family drama of these kind of characters sort of dying off one by one, and that brings us sort of closer and closer to the sort of the idea of potentially the Rainbow Nation of South Africa. I think this is so excellent. The writing style of this is just sublime. I think this is phenomenal. I have adored the other book of Damon Galgut's I've read before, and I would personally love to see this be in the shortlist, if not the winner. But it is tied in my mind with another book. This is one of the few times now where I'm like, actually having 2 winners this year would be perfect if it's these 2 winners for me. The other winner being, in my mind, Richard Powers with Bewilderment. I think I might have called it Overstory earlier. But yes, Bewilderment. So this story is all about a father looking after his son who is on the spectrum and trying to help him navigate the world. And often this is a world that is not geared to look after him and not geared to understand him. And at the same time, this is happening alongside the fight for the fight against climate change and the fight for kind of conserving various bits of wildlife, and you get this young passionate son who's really fighting for it. And I just thought this was gorgeous, and I was so emotionally hit by this book. I just thought it was stunningly done and really insightful. This book could have very easily, I think, veered into sort of almost pastiche, or really kind of so it could have been very generic. But Richard Powers writes his socks off in this book. It is so clearly articulated. It's so emotional, and I just think it's excellent. It's really good. And so yeah, these 2 are my right at the top. If there were a star beyond 5 stars, I would probably give it to them. Especially, I think maybe Bewilderment. I think Bewilderment is the one that's sort of pushing just above The Promise for me more regularly. But I mean, I think both are absolutely fabulous. So those are my top 2. And then that leaves me with 4 spaces, which is now like choosing a little bit between my favourite kids, even though these are books that I did not write, so I cannot claim them as my kids. And also that's a bit weird. But, and of those books, the first other one that I would really love to see on there is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. I've done a separate review of this, which may come out before or after this. I haven't yet decided. You will now know. But I thought Great Circle was such a powerful, brilliant epic of a book. It is about 600 pages long, but it is so tightly written. It was taken from a 1,000-page manuscript down to 600, and you can see that it's been worked on in that sense because it's so tight. There are very few words or parts or things in this that I think you could take out and still get the same story. I think it's really well done. This book is largely about a woman, Marion, who is a female pilot who wants to fly across the world. But there's so much more to it than that, because she's paralleled in her modern day, the sort of modern day sort of parallel that we are given is this woman Hadley, who is an actress and is sort of facing similar issues. So both women, for example, experience what it's like to be a successful woman, having to fight to get your voice heard, but also having to play the game, and particularly a very sort of masculine, male-oriented game, to be able to succeed. You know, either being forced to trade favors for success, or kind of knowing that they've got to find ways to sacrifice and give up everything. And there's just this really beautiful unspoken bond between these two women who have never met. And I thought it was really well done. It's written like a dream. It's beautiful. I will keep talking about this book a lot this year, I think. I just think it's really stunningly done. And could so easily not have been as wonderful as it actually is. So yeah, that's the other one I would put on this list for the moment. So I think those three, I mean, pretty much all of the 6 that I'm choosing, I would be happy to have win. But I think these 3 especially, I have quite a soft spot for in my heart. Next is, I think, The Fortune Men by Nadif bin Mohammed. I really enjoyed this book, a book that looks at the community, a sort of a multi sort of ethnic, diverse community in Tiger Bay in Cardiff in the 1950s. There is a murder, and in the process of kind of the trial around this, the finger is pointed at a young Somali man who is sort of scapegoated and has everything put on him. And what I think is so clever is The Fortune Men really articulates what that could look like to various people. So various minorities and various groups within struggling to really work out who they are and how they fit in to everything that's going on. And I just think it's exceptional. I think it's really well done. I think, you know, maybe the other 3 books I mentioned earlier, I might have as a slight smidge ahead on this list. But I mean, ultimately, this is a brilliant book. I think it more than deserves a shortlisting. I think this is a kind of story that we don't often get to hear. It's actually based on a real life story as well. And I think this is really an important book. And I really enjoyed the vividness of the lives of these characters. Really brought to life very, very well in this book, I think. So that's place number 4, which leaves me only 2 spaces, which is horrible, because this is hard. The next one I would say is Anouk Arad-Purgasam's A Passage North. I know this has been a bit of a mixed one, and I know that for some people it did really lag in the middle, myself included. I may have also just been very tired when I was trying to read it. But A Passage North, and again, as you can tell by the preponderance of pink post-its all the way through this, I had a lot about this book that I wanted to quote and keep track of, because I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was so cleverly done, and I was just in love with it, really. It's a slow, meditative book of a man going on a journey to the north, a passage north, as you can tell, to go and see family. But so much happens in the meantime. There's a lot that happens internally where he really processes what it means to be who he is, to be in a family, to be in a nation, to be part of the nation of Sri Lanka, and the various politics and sort of history that surrounds it. And what I think is so clever about how this book does it is it somehow finds a way of taking big national issues and internalizing all of them in a way that for me didn't feel self-indulgent or self-important. This character could have so easily been like, oh, but my life's really hard because there are all these people having a war and stuff. What's with that? Instead, I mean, I don't think really that many writers write that, but you get the odd example. And what I think is really clever is actually this book never feels like this character is pitying himself at all. Indeed, like if anything, this character is really trying to understand the world and is really trying to look out for people around him, even if he is a bit distant. And there is sort of something I sort of said in my separate review about it, for me, about there being a train on this. This is how it feels. This idea of looking at the world through a train window and sometimes feeling quite powerless to change anything beyond, but also being very much part of it. It affects you. The fact that there are people maybe rioting outside might affect your train. It might affect other things around you. And I think this is what this book does so cleverly and so well for me. And I would just love to see this book get that extra little nudge of love by being on the shortlist. I think it personally deserves it. And as you can see from my the little review I did for it, I raved about it, had so much to say about it, and I just think it's stunning and really, really important. So yeah, there we go. And last but not least, my final hope for the shortlist is Sanjeev Sahot's A China Room, or just China Room, I think it is. I thought this book was so brilliant. I really enjoyed how it managed to weave together so many, these two sort of parallel stories. I think the writing is exquisite for this book. I loved how it sort of balanced the life of this young woman, Meha, in who's sort of basically trying to work out the world around her. And I said in my sort of individual review for it as well, but it feels like every character is watching everybody else in a way that the narrative constantly feels like an eye roving around a room, trying to kind of get clues for how to behave. And I was so stunned by how that was written and sort of how it was told that it made me so happy. I thought it was just such an excellent book, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I'd love to see this make the shortlist. Yeah, it's really well told, and we get this other parallel life of a man in the sort of more modern day, sort of late 90s, early 2000s, who is struggling with drug addiction. And as a big part of that, we get this story of him really struggling, and him sort of trying to find a way to kind of come back to normality. But at the same time, his life then overlaps with Mayha, because he's back in the farm and in the house that has the China room that sort of started all this. So I just thought it was a really well done book, and I'd love to see it. And this would be his second shortlisting, and I think he deserves this sort of recognition personally. And then I think, as you can tell from those 6, literally Bewilderment or The Promise winning, either is great by my reckoning. And yeah, I love that. But there are 2 other books that I wanted to talk about that for me were so close to being on my sort of fantasy shortlist, and I still would be delighted if they made it on. There isn't too much for me between my top 6 and number 7 and 8, which are these next 2. The first of which is An Island by Karen Jennings. Sort of, as mentioned, this sort of independent book. I did a separate review on this, but I sort of spoke a bit about how I found it really affecting at the end, especially as we watch as this man who lives on an island alone and sort of has a migrant wash up on shore, how his own traumas and sort of lapses in memory really mean that he cannot connect to the world, and cannot really connect to the situation, and as such is sort of trapped and really isolated, but also becomes increasingly violent and erratic. And I just thought it was so well told, and there's not too much of a reason why it's not on my dream shortlist. I think for me, maybe a tiny bit that I think the beginning of the story wasn't particularly as strong, but I think it was building up for what came at the end of this book, and I still think it's a really worthy shortlisted, a book really worthy of being shortlisted. So yeah, and my other potential shortlist, and this is one that I think is maybe more likely actually to be shortlisted than some of the other ones I mentioned, and that is Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Shiguro. I did a separate review on this way back, not long after it came out, and just absolutely loved it as a book. I just thought it was so beautiful. I really felt a lot of emotion towards this AF, this artificial friend character in the book. I just thought she was so well painted and interesting, and the way that it brought up this idea of, can a robot or kind of a mechanical thing have faith? Can that exist? And I think it's such an interesting discussion anyway. And then to have it kind of done so well in this book, I just think is great. Ishiguro is a great writer, and I know that for some people this book did not tick their boxes at all. Totally understand that. I get that particularly if you're someone who really enjoys sci-fi, this might feel like a less well done sci-fi, whereas I guess I'm coming at it as someone who doesn't really read all that much sci-fi, would like to, but just I haven't really done that much. And so I think maybe that's why it appeals to me. Maybe I'm also giving it more of a look in because it's Ishiguro and I love him, he's great. So yes, I just think this book is just really well done. And the only reason really I've left it off my kind of fantasy shortlist is because I'd love to see some of those other books by less well-known authors get a little kind of nudge up. But again, if this made the shortlist, I would not be angry. I think it's fine. It's a great book, and I think it you know, Ishiguro deserves the love for creating something so powerful and so interesting, and just kind of constantly still bringing his fantastic attention to detail in writing to this book. In terms of actual predictions, I'm hoping that my personal favourites are not too far off the mark. I think the 2 that are fairly safe are also my top 2, which are The Promise by Damon Galgut and Bewilderment by Richard Powers. I think those 2 are fairly safe and fairly locked in. I think prediction in terms of what is probably also likely to make it on there, I think Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro is also fairly likely to make the shortlist. I think it's a kind of book that seems like it would sort of, I think the fact that it got longlisted to me shows that it probably has a good chance of being shortlisted, because I think other Ishiguro books have not been longlisted recently, as far as I'm aware. And he tends to have quite a good conversion rate of going from being longlisted to being shortlisted. So I think the fact that it's made it on there I think it's a book that's strong enough to make it into a shortlist as well. I also think, in terms of books that are probably quite likely, I think Great Circle, just by the kind of buzz around it and how people have spoken about it, I think has a really strong chance. I think it's a book that deserves it, obviously, personally, because I chose it to be there myself. And I think it's one that could well make it. And then for me, for the other two places, I think it's a real toss-up. I think China Room has a really solid chance. We've seen that Sahota's been shortlisted before, deservedly so, but I think this book is better than the last one he was shortlisted for, so there we go. I also think Sweetness of Water might make it onto the shortlist. I wouldn't be too surprised if it kind of made it on there. It's not a book that I necessarily got on that well with. And I say that not to say it's a bad book at all, just that I listened to the audiobook for it and I think I was a bit distracted, which didn't help. But I can't really point to a point of the book that I really have a strong mental image of. And that sort of worries me, that there's sort of, I'm not sure, I think that is probably more a me problem. I've seen people review it online and talk, you know, gushingly about how much they loved it. So maybe it is just me. It probably is. So I think The Sweetness of Water is another book that could make it onto the list. I also think and hope that The Fortune Men could be one of the ones that makes it onto the shortlist. I think that's got a strong chance. I think it's a book that is really interesting, that has quite universal appeal, and I think is one that could kind of make it to the end. But I also in some ways wouldn't be surprised if something like Second Place by Rachel Cusk made it on there. I didn't necessarily get on with it. I kind of, again, don't really remember too much about it. I read it as an advanced copy ages ago. But I kind of think, again, almost the fact that it's made the long list might be one of those things where people have seen something in it that I absolutely haven't. And as a result, it may well have a strong chance. But who knows? The shortlist will be coming out very soon, and I'm excited to see what that actually means and what that looks like. It's quite refreshing in some ways now to have read it. And I'm like, oh, am I free now? What do I do? I've read the long list. Who am I now? What do I do? Like, who am I? Help me. But I think there are a couple of books. So The Sweetness of Water and A Town Called Solace are two books I didn't necessarily get on with, but also don't really feel like I remember much of. So I do think if either of those two make it onto the shortlist, I think I probably owe it to myself to read them again, just because I think I really want to actually experience them properly, because I just don't think I took in much the first time. And that is something that's really worth noting for the Booker long list, is that the books that make it to the shortlist, by the time they get to the shortlist, would have been read twice. So how it works is the judges read all 160 books, they pick their top 13 together. Then from those top 13, they reread them all and choose their top 6, which is the shortlist. Then, after they've chosen the shortlist, they reread those 6 and the winner is chosen. And as a result, the shortlist books will be read 3 times. All books long listed will have been read twice. And so I'm also trying to think what books will stand up to multiple readings. Again, I think that really helps books like The Promise and Bewilderment, because I think they're both so strong and so detailed and kind of rich that I think they've got something more to give on a second reading. I think the same is true for Great Circle by the author whose name I've just forgotten, Maggie Shipstead. I think that book, not only because it's 600 pages and so therefore has more in it, but I think there are so many references that the book makes at the beginning that are picked up again at the end that I think a second reading would be really fruitful, because you sort of see how the seeds have been planted. And that, for me, is often a sign of a really strong book. I think a second reading, I can't quite see how, I'm not entirely sure what that would mean for something like Clara and the Sun. I think that might actually be to its disadvantage potentially. But I think a second reading might also really help a book I really love, A Passage North, because this book is so deep and meditative that I think knowing what's coming later, even though the plot isn't really the most important part of it, I think might also lead to a richer reading experience. I think something like A Town Called Solace could really benefit from a second reading, because I think there are so many little seeds that are dropped through that as well. So I'm really eager to see what happens. Essentially, all this boils down to is here are 6 books, well, here are 8 books that I really like, sort of painfully chosen into forced into being a 6, and then me wildly guessing at what the Booker judges are thinking after I've already been proved that, you know, it's already been proved that we are not always thinking the same things, given that I chose very different books for the long list, my sort of dream long list. Anyway, that all said, I would love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think is going to make this shortlist, and why, really? I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on why you think certain books will edge out others. It's an interesting one, because this, you know, 2020 was full of lots of debut authors and was really exciting for that. This year has a lot of really established authors, particularly people like Damon Galgut, Richard Powers, Kazuo Shiguro, who are no strangers to a good old prize. So I think it's going to be a really interesting one. I'd love to see what happens, and we will find out, I think in November, who the winner is. So for now, get your shortlist predictions in, and I can't wait to sort of react to it once the shortlist has been announced and realise that I was entirely wrong. As usual, I've been Bob the Bookerer. I hope you enjoy your reading, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this wonderful long list. Thank you, take care, and bye-bye. Enjoy your reading.